My son-in-law poured me a glass of iced tea on a Sunday afternoon and told me he loved me like a father. 3 hours later, I was sitting in my car in their driveway, my hands trembling over a folder of documents I was never supposed to find. What was inside wasn't just a betrayal. It was a blueprint, a carefully engineered plan to take everything I had ever built and leave me with nothing. Not my home, not my savings, not even my own name on my own accounts. And the person who had signed her name to it was my daughter. Before I tell you how I dismantled every single piece of what they built, please take a moment to let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you stay until the end, I promise you the way this story closes will not be what you expect. I am 64 years old. I spent 38 years as a senior fraud examiner for one of the largest insurance companies in the country. I have reviewed more fabricated documents than most federal prosecutors. I know what a forged signature looks like. I know what a manufactured paper trail smells like. I know how people who believe they are clever always make the same kind of mistake. They underestimate the person they are stealing from. My wife, Carol, passed away 2 years ago in March. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the morning, I held her hand in the hospice room and watched her go somewhere I couldn't follow. We had been married for 39 years. She was the warmest person I have ever known, the kind of woman who remembered every birthday of every neighbor on our street and kept a drawer full of sympathy cards already stamped, just in case someone needed one quickly. When she died, the house became a place I lived in rather than a home I belonged to. My daughter was 36 at the time. She flew in from Charlotte for the funeral, and she cried at the graveside in a way that looked real to everyone who didn't know her as well as I did. My son-in-law stood beside her with his hand on the small of her back, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him a little too well for a man who had been borrowing money from us 6 months prior. They had married 5 years earlier. I gave her away at a vineyard wedding in Virginia that I paid for entirely. My son-in-law was charming in the particular way of men who have learned that charm is a currency. He sold commercial real estate. He talked about deals the way other men talk about sports, with a breathless enthusiasm that always seemed one step removed from desperation. My daughter had inherited Carol's warmth on the surface, and I would learn something harder underneath. After Carol died, my daughter called more often. She asked about my health, my sleep, whether I was eating properly. She floated the idea of me moving closer to them in Charlotte. I told her I was fine, that I had my routines, my friends from the firm, my morning walks along the lake path behind our neighborhood. I told her I didn't need looking after. I was 64, not 84. What I did not tell her was that I had been watching. It had started 6 months after Carol passed, when I noticed a small anomaly. A phone call from my financial advisor, a man I had used for 20 years, letting me know that someone had called his office asking about the process for updating account beneficiaries on my behalf. The caller had identified herself as my daughter. My advisor, who was meticulous, had flagged it because I had never authorized any third-party contact on my accounts. I thanked him. I asked him not to mention it to anyone, and I began to pay attention. Over the following months, small things accumulated the way they always do in fraud cases, individually meaningless, collectively damning. A piece of mail from my estate attorney's office had been opened and resealed poorly. My daughter began asking very specific questions about my property, whether the house was paid off, whether I still had the investment accounts Carol and I had built together, whether I had ever thought about simplifying things by putting everything under one umbrella. She used the word simplifying 3 times in 2 separate phone calls. I wrote it down in a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer. My son-in-law was more subtle, but less careful. At Easter, when they visited and I had stepped outside to check on the grill, I came back to find him standing near my desk in the study. He said he had been looking for a pen. My desk was not near the door. It was in the far corner of the room beside the window. There are pens in a cup on the kitchen counter. There always have been. I said nothing. I noted it. The Labor Day weekend was my daughter's idea. She called in late August and said she wanted to do something special, that it had been too long since we had a real family gathering, that she missed me and wanted me to come stay with them for the long weekend. Her voice had the particular softness she uses when she wants something. Carol used to call it her asking voice. I recognized it. I said yes. I drove down on the Friday. Their house was a large colonial in a good neighborhood, more house than two people needed, with a three-car garage and a kitchen that had been recently renovated with the kind of fixtures that cost more than my first car. I had noticed on previous visits that their lifestyle had a persistent quality of overextension: the lease on my son-in-law's truck, the new patio furniture, the wine rack stocked with bottles I knew were not cheap. But real estate commissions are unpredictable, and I had told myself reasonable stories. The weekend started pleasantly enough. My son-in-law grilled steaks on Saturday night. My daughter made a peach cobbler that was Carol's recipe, and for a moment, standing in their bright kitchen, watching her spoon it into bowls, I felt something loosen in my chest. She looked so much like her mother from behind. The same way of standing with her weight on one hip. The same efficient way of moving through a kitchen. But I had not driven 4 hours to enjoy a long weekend. On Sunday morning, my son-in-law left early to meet a client, or so he said. My daughter went to a yoga class. I had the house to myself for 90 minutes. I want to be clear. I did not go looking to confirm a theory. I went to the garage to find a crescent wrench because I had noticed a loose bolt on the deck railing the evening before, and it bothered me in the way that small hazards bother men who spent 4 decades identifying risk. The garage was organized in the aggressive way of someone who wants to appear organized. Tools on pegboards, storage bins labeled in a blocky handwriting I recognized as my son-in-law's. Along the back wall was a metal shelving unit holding cardboard file boxes, the kind with lids. I scanned the labels: tax returns, HOA docs, auto, insurance, and then one that stopped me cold. The label read, Dad Estate. I stood very still for a moment. The refrigerator in the corner of the garage hummed. Outside, a lawnmower started up somewhere down the street. My name is not Dad to anyone except my daughter. There is no shared estate between me and my son-in-law. That box had no business existing. I lifted it off the shelf. It was not heavy. I set it on the hood of the car, removed the lid, and looked inside. There were 4 documents. I will tell you what they were, and I want you to understand that I am not a man who frightens easily. I spent nearly 4 decades reviewing the paperwork of people who had committed fraud, and I had seen creative cruelty in all its forms. But what I held in that garage on a Sunday morning made my stomach drop in a way that had nothing to do with professional detachment. The first was a photocopy of a durable power of attorney document, bearing my name as the principal and my daughter's name as the agent. The signature on the line marked principal was mine, except I had never signed it. I had never seen this document in my life. I have a specific way of signing my name that I developed intentionally during my career, a small loop at the tail of my last initial, that I vary in a way only I would recognize as a tell. The signature on this document did not have the loop. It was a very good forgery, but it was a forgery. The second document was a letter, printed on plain paper, addressed to my financial institution. It was dated 6 weeks prior. It requested a change of beneficiary on my primary investment account, a brokerage account holding approximately $900,000, naming my daughter as the sole beneficiary. It was signed with the same forged signature. The third was a printed email thread between my son-in-law and a man I did not recognize. The subject line was Elder Care Planning Next Steps. The content of the thread discussed the process of petitioning a court for guardianship of an elderly individual on the grounds of cognitive decline. My son-in-law had written, in his own words, "The key is documentation. We need to start building the paper trail now. Doctor visits, incidents, the more the better." My daughter had replied with one line, "How long does the process take once we file?" The fourth document was a 2-page summary from an attorney whose name I did not know, in Charlotte, outlining the general framework of a guardianship petition and the conditions under which a guardian gains legal control over an individual's financial and personal decisions. I read all 4 documents twice. My hands were steady. That surprised me in a distant way. But shock, in my experience, does not arrive as trembling. It arrives as a strange clarity, the moment when a case that has been building in fragments suddenly snaps into a single coherent picture. They were not going to poison me. They were going to erase me. Legally, methodically, paper by paper. They would use the forged power of attorney to access my accounts while I was still alive. They would build a manufactured record of cognitive decline, misplaced items, confusions, medical visits I didn't need to support a guardianship petition, a sympathetic judge, a compliant doctor, and one day I would be the confused old man in the courtroom who couldn't manage his own affairs while my daughter managed them for me. I stood there in their garage for a long time. The lawnmower down the street finished and the neighborhood went quiet again. I looked at the family photographs on the garage wall, my daughter at her college graduation, her and my son-in-law at their wedding, a photo of the three of us at the beach the summer before Carol got sick. Carol was in that photo too, squinting into the sun, laughing at something off camera. I couldn't remember what. I replaced the documents in exactly the order I had found them. I put the lid back on the box. I put the box back on the shelf in the exact position it had been in. I found the crescent wrench 2 bins over and tightened the bolt on the deck railing. When my daughter came home from yoga with pink cheeks and a water bottle, I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee, reading the sports section of a newspaper I had found on their kitchen table. She asked if I had slept well. I told her I had slept like a stone. I drove home Monday morning after breakfast. I hugged her at the door and told her it had been a wonderful weekend, that I had needed it more than I knew. She held on a beat longer than usual. My son-in-law shook my hand with both of his, the handshake of men who want you to feel trusted. I drove north for 4 hours, and I did not turn on the radio. I thought about everything I knew and everything I needed to know. A forgery is difficult to prosecute without an original to compare it to. An intent to commit guardianship fraud requires establishing not just the document but the scheme. I needed more than what I had found. I needed what my years in the field had taught me every good case requires. A paper trail that tells its own story, in its own words, without needing me to explain it. When I got home, I called the only person I trusted without condition. His name was Frank, and he had been my attorney for 22 years. Before that, he had been my wife's cousin's college roommate, which was how we met, and the relationship had grown from professional into something closer to family. I called his cell, not his office, because I did not want a record on his firm's phone system yet. He answered on the 3rd ring. I could hear a baseball game in the background. "Frank," I said, "I need to meet with you this week. Something serious has come up." He turned the game off. "How serious?" I told him. I spoke for 15 minutes, and I kept my voice the same flat, even tone I had used in 100 deposition rooms. I described each document. I described the email chain. I told him about the financial advisor call from 8 months prior. I told him about my son-in-law standing at my desk, looking for a pen. There was a long silence. "Jacob," he said, "are you safe right now?" "I'm home," I told him. "My doors are locked. I don't believe I'm in immediate physical danger. This is a financial operation, not a violent one." "Okay." Another pause. "First thing tomorrow, I need you to write down everything you observed in that garage time, location, exact description of each document while it's fresh. Don't type it. Write it by hand and date it. Second, do not call your financial institution yet. Do not move any money. Do not change anything. If they've already attempted to submit that letter to your brokerage, I need to find out the status before we tip them off that you know. Third, and this is important, Jacob, do not call your daughter. Do not change your behavior toward her in any way. Can you do that?" "I can do that," I said. "I'll call you at 8 tomorrow morning." I sat in my armchair that night in the dark for a long time. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet since March 2 years ago. Not peaceful quiet, but empty quiet. The grandfather clock in the hall marked out the hours, and I thought about my daughter. I thought about the girl who used to climb into our bed on Sunday mornings and wedge herself between Carol and me, warm and small and entirely trusting. I thought about the way she had looked at her mother's grave, the tears that might have been real, that I still could not be certain were not real. I thought about whether grief does something to people, whether Carol's death had fractured something in her that had realigned around a different set of values. But then I thought about the email. How long does the process take once we file? Type 6 weeks after her mother's funeral. Whatever grief had done or not done, that sentence had been written by someone who was planning. I did not sleep, but I was not awake in the way of a frightened man. I was awake in the way of a man who has accepted the terms of a situation and is working the problem. Frank called at 8:03. He had been busy. I contacted your brokerage this morning, quietly, through a colleague who handles their compliance work, he said. The letter was received. It was flagged for follow-up verification because the account size triggered an automatic review process. They had called the number on file your cell and gotten no answer. They were going to send a written verification request to your mailing address this week, which means the change has not been processed, which means we got there first. The number they called was my cell, and I had not received any call from my brokerage, which meant the letter had included a callback number that was not mine. I told Frank this. I know, he said. The number on the letter traces to a prepaid phone. I have a contact at the county prosecutor's office. I've already made a call. Then he told me the rest of what he had found overnight. And I want you to understand that even for a man who had spent 38 years in fraud investigation, what he described had a weight to it that pressed down on the chest. My son-in-law had 3 properties in foreclosure proceedings. Not 1, 3. 2 were investment properties he had purchased at the height of his ambitions. The third was a condo in Charleston. He had bought using money borrowed against a line of credit on their Charlotte home, which was itself mortgaged to 80% of its value. His real estate license had a complaint filed against it 18 months prior by a client claiming misrepresentation, a complaint that was still in review. His credit score, which Frank's contact had pulled through a process I did not ask too many questions about, was below 500 and falling. My daughter's business, a home staging company she had started 4 years ago, had ceased operations 7 months prior. The business entity had been formally dissolved. The accounts had been closed. She had not told me this. They had not been overextended. They had been drowning for years in water that had been rising around them while they furnished new patios and stocked wine racks and drove leased trucks and came to their father-in-law's house for Labor Day weekend with smiles that had gotten very good at looking like love. The motive was not greed in the simple sense. The motive was panic, the kind of panic that causes rational people to make decisions that are anything but rational because when the walls are close enough, any door looks like a way out. Frank's contact at the prosecutor's office was a woman named Karen Delaney who handled financial crimes. She called me directly on a Wednesday afternoon. Her voice was businesslike and precise. "Mr. Harper," she said, "I've reviewed the documents your attorney provided, and I want to be straightforward with you about where we are. What you've described, if proven, constitutes multiple felony offenses: forgery, fraud, attempted fraudulent transfer of assets, depending on what else we find, potentially conspiracy. These are serious charges. But right now, the core of our case rests on your testimony and photocopies of documents that are still sitting in a box in your daughter's garage. What I need is the original documents, and ideally, more." "What kind of more?" I asked. "Communication. Texts, emails, anything that establishes intent. The email thread you described is exactly the kind of evidence that makes a case unambiguous. If those emails exist on their devices or in their accounts, they will tell the story themselves. We can get there. But it takes time." "How much time?" I asked. "A few weeks, maybe 4. She paused. "Mr. Harper, I need to ask you something. Have you had any recent medical appointments that your daughter might have been involved in scheduling or accompanying you to?" "No," I said slowly. "No doctor who might have had an unusual visit from her? Or a call about your cognitive health?" I thought about it carefully. 3 months ago, my internist had called me to reschedule an annual physical. His receptionist had mentioned, in a slightly puzzled tone, that my daughter had called to confirm the appointment time. I had thought nothing of it at the time. I told Delaney. "Then they've already started building it," she said, her voice unchanged, but something sharpening underneath. "They've been laying groundwork with your doctor, which means the guardianship petition is not a future plan. It is an active one." I sat with that for a moment. The idea that somewhere in Charlotte, people who called me dad and said grace before meals were actively manufacturing the evidence of my deterioration. "Mr. Harper," Delaney said, "I want you to know something. Elder financial abuse is the fastest growing financial crime in this country. Most victims never find out until the damage is done, until the accounts are empty and the deed has been transferred and the judge has signed the order. You found out because of what you know and what you do. Now I need you to let me do what I know and do. Give me 4 weeks. "I'll give you 4 weeks, I said. What happened over those 4 weeks I learned later in pieces. The search warrant for my son-in-law's email accounts turned up 43 messages between him and my daughter over 9 months, discussing what they called the plan. The emails were specific. They discussed the forgery. They discussed the prepaid phone. They discussed the Charlotte attorney who had been advising them on guardianship procedure, an attorney who, I later learned, had represented 2 other similar cases and was himself subsequently investigated. They discussed timing. They discussed what they would tell me and when. There was one email from my daughter, sent on a Sunday night, that Delaney read to me over the phone in a flat, careful voice. I will not repeat it in full. But there was one line in it that I have thought about every day since. She wrote, "He trusts me completely. That's the hardest part." Delaney paused after reading it. She did not say anything for a moment. Neither did I. The hardest part, she said finally, is also what she got wrong. 2 days before the arrest warrants were issued, I made a phone call to my daughter. I kept my voice warm. I told her I had been thinking about the weekend, that it had meant more than I could say, that I wanted to come back down the following month. She sounded genuinely pleased. She asked about my health, whether I was sleeping. She said she had been worried about me. I said I was fine, that I felt clear-headed, better than I had in months. I said it deliberately, and I listened to the brief silence on her end. When I said it, the silence of a person recalibrating a plan. What I did not tell her was that 3 weeks prior, I had met with Frank for 4 hours, and we had done something I had been quietly preparing for the previous 2 years, since before Carol died, since the first time my son-in-law had asked, with just enough casualness, whether I had updated my estate documents recently. I had established an irrevocable trust, the Harper Family Trust. Into it I had placed the house, the investment accounts, the savings, the whole of what Carol and I had built across 40 years. The total value was approximately $2.4 million. My daughter was named as the sole beneficiary upon my death. But the trust contained a clause. It had been drafted carefully, reviewed by 2 separate estate attorneys, and was, as Frank told me, airtight. The clause was simple. Should the beneficiary be convicted of any felony offense, state or federal, the trust would not pass to her. Should the beneficiary be found to have engaged in any fraudulent, coercive, or criminal activity directed toward the grantor, meaning me, the trust would not pass to her. In either case, the full amount would be liquidated and transferred to a non-profit organization dedicated to the prevention of elder financial abuse. The clause had been in place for 14 months. Everything they had been building, the forged signature, the manufactured medical paper trail, the guardianship attorney, the 43 emails, the prepaid phone had been aimed at inheriting something that had already been restructured so that their crimes would ensure they received nothing. They had not been trying to steal my money. They had, without knowing it, been ensuring it went to strangers. I want to tell you about the morning of the arrest, because it matters. Delaney's team picked them up separately. My son-in-law was at a coffee shop near his office at 8:15 in the morning. 2 plainclothes officers approached his table while he was checking his phone over a latte. My daughter was at their house. She answered the door in her robe. Delaney called me when it was done. Her voice was even and professional, but I could hear something underneath it, a particular quality that I recognized from my own career, the specific satisfaction of a case closing cleanly. "It's done, Mr. Harper," she said, "both in custody. The Charlotte attorney has also been brought in for questioning. This is going to have some legs." "Thank you," I said. I meant it more than those 2 words could hold. "No," she said, "thank you. Most people in your position, by the time they find out, it's too late. You found out because you paid attention. And then you were disciplined enough to wait and let us build it right. That's unusual." I told her I had been in the business of paying attention for 38 years. She said it showed. The legal proceedings took 7 months. I will not walk you through every detail because much of it was the slow, grinding machinery of the justice system, continuances, motions, plea discussions that collapsed, a trial date set, and then move. I want to tell you the parts that mattered. My son-in-law pled guilty to forgery, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse. He was sentenced to 11 years. He will serve a minimum of 8. My daughter went to trial. Her attorney argued that she had been coerced by her husband, that she had been a reluctant participant who had been manipulated by a controlling partner. The jury heard the 43 emails. They heard the email that contained the line about trust being the hardest part. They deliberated for 3 days. They convicted her on all counts. She was sentenced to 9 years. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing. I sat in the gallery, not at the prosecutor's table, because I was a witness and not a party. When the judge read the sentence, my daughter turned from her seat at the defense table and looked at me. I have tried, in the months since, to read what was in that look. I have not been able to do it with any certainty. There was something in it, something that might have been shame or anger or a grief that had arrived far too late. I held her gaze until she turned away. I did not stay for the processing. I thanked Delaney in the hallway outside the courtroom. I shook her hand. I walked out of the building into a cold November afternoon, and I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing the sharp air, watching a woman across the street try to fold a stroller with one hand while holding a coffee cup in the other. Life was just happening everywhere, all around the edges of the worst thing I had experienced since the hospice room 2.5 years ago. I drove home. I made a pot of coffee. I sat in the armchair where Carol used to read, and I let myself feel what there was to feel. People expect, I think, that justice delivers something clean, a closing, a completed transaction. What it actually delivers is a kind of stillness, the stillness that follows a long noise, not silence exactly, but the absence of the particular sound you had gotten used to. The grief was still there, the loss was still there. Not just of my daughter, but of the version of her I had believed in, the girl from the Sunday mornings, the one who cried at her mother's grave. I did not know whether to mourn that version or to accept that she had never been quite what I thought she was. Perhaps both things were true. Perhaps you can love someone and still not know them. I had been thinking, in the weeks before sentencing, about the trust, about what would happen to $2.4 million that belonged, now, to no one in my family. Frank had confirmed that the clause had been triggered. The assets would be liquidated and transferred to the National Council on Elder Financial Abuse, a nonprofit that funds legal aid and education programs for seniors targeted by financial predators, organizations that help people who do not have 38 years of fraud investigation experience, or a Frank, or the particular luck of knowing what to look for in a garage. It felt right. It felt more than right. It felt like the only thing that made sense, that the money they had tried to steal would go directly to preventing the theft of someone else's. But I kept back one account, a modest one, with about $90,000 in it, Carol's savings from the years before we merged everything, an account she had kept in her own name as a point of personal independence that I had always respected and never questioned. I had not put this in the trust. It was mine, free and clear, and it was enough. I sat down at the desk in the study, the one my son-in-law had once stood beside, looking for a pen, and I opened my checkbook. I thought for a long time about what to write. I thought about the woman in Charlotte who would never be named, never know my name, who would sit across from a legal aid attorney in a small office someday and find out that someone had thought about her before she existed in any concrete way. I thought about Carol, who had kept stamped sympathy cards in a drawer because she believed that compassion required readiness, that you had to have the infrastructure in place before the moment of need arrived. I wrote a check to a local Adult Protective Services Foundation, a smaller, regional organization that I had researched carefully and found to be well-run and direct in its impact. The amount was not the entirety of what I had. It was a third of it. Enough to matter, not so much that I was left without a floor. In the memo line I wrote, "In memory of Carol Harper, who paid attention to people." I signed my name on the line, and the loop at the tail of my last initial was exactly where it always was. This is what I want to leave you with. Not the betrayal, and not the conviction, and not even the trap that closed around people who thought they were setting one. What I want you to take from this is something simpler and harder at the same time. We tell ourselves, when it comes to the people closest to us, that love is a kind of certainty, that the people who know us best could not possibly mean us harm. And that belief, that deep, human refusal to apply the same clear eyes to our own lives that we apply everywhere else, is exactly the vulnerability that people like my son-in-law understand how to find. The strongest thing I did was not finding that folder. It was the decision, in that moment, to feel everything I felt and still act like nothing had changed. To walk back out onto the deck with a cup of coffee and read the sports section as if the world were still the same shape it had been before I walked into the garage. That took more from me than anything else in this story, and it was the thing that made everything else possible. I have been asked, since this became known among my circle of colleagues and friends, whether I would have done anything differently, whether I would have confronted her sooner, whether I regret the 4 weeks of waiting while the case was being built. My answer is no. Not because I am cold, or because I am hard, but because I have spent my entire working life learning that the difference between suspicion and proof is the difference between a story and a case. Anyone can have a story. It takes patience and discipline and the willingness to hold your own grief at arm's length long enough to let the truth become undeniable, not just to you, but to a room full of strangers who owe you nothing. I am 64 years old. I live alone in the house where I raised my daughter and loved my wife. In the mornings, I walk the lake path behind the neighborhood, and the geese that live along the far bank have gotten used to me enough that they no longer move when I pass. I have lunch on Tuesdays with a retired colleague who tells the same 3 stories from the 80s and still makes me laugh at all of them. On Sunday mornings, the house is quiet in a way that I am slowly learning to accept rather than simply endure. The grandfather clock still marks the hours. I still sit in Carol's armchair sometimes, and I still keep a small notebook in the desk drawer, because paying attention is not something you turn off just because the immediate crisis has passed. It is how I understand the world. It is, at this point, simply who I am. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. The people who underestimate you are counting on you to let them. The greatest advantage you have is the one they cannot see. What would you have done in my position, I'd like to know. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from.